Greetings, listeners. I've heard from some of you that the Bible can feel overwhelming. It's long, there are different authors, different time periods. But let me tell you something, underneath it all, there's only one story. And once you start to see it, the rest of the Bible begins to come into focus. Well, welcome everyone. I'm your host, Jackie Adewale, and this is the Bible Basics Podcast, where every 2 weeks we break down the basics of the Bible into understandable, bite-sized chunks. Today, we're stepping back to look at that whole big picture of the Bible. Because the Bible, all 66 books, written over centuries, is telling one unified story. And that story moves through 5 moments: creation, fall, promise, redemption, and restoration. We're going to walk through each one slowly. First is creation. The story begins in Genesis. God creates everything that exists: light, land, living creatures, and then human beings, Adam and Eve. They're made in God's image, and we see that in Genesis chapter 1, 26 to 27. That means they reflect Him in a unique way. They can think, create, choose, form relationships, and they can know God personally. They're not distant from Him. They're invited into relationship, given responsibility, and placed in a world that God calls good. In fact, in Genesis 1:31, He says it's very good. And this is how the story begins: with goodness, with closeness, with trust. Then there's the fall. In Genesis 3, something changes that affects every person who has ever lived. Adam and Eve are faced with a choice. Will they trust God or decide for themselves what is right? They chose not to trust Him. And we see that in Genesis 3, 1 through 7. And that choice breaks something deep. Not just around them, but inside them. They hide. They feel shame. They become afraid of God instead of close to Him. And that same pattern shows up in us. The Bible calls this sin. At its core, it's choosing not to trust God and deciding we'll define things for ourselves instead. And that choice touches everything: how we see ourselves, how we treat others, how we relate to God. But the story doesn't stop there. Even in that moment, God makes a promise that one day someone will come and deal with the source of all this brokenness. That's the next moment, the promise. From that point on, the story begins to narrow. In Genesis 12, God chooses one man, Abraham, and He makes a promise: through your family, the world will be blessed. That's Genesis 12, 1 through 3. So now the story focuses on one family, not to leave others out, but to reach everyone through them. And over time, God keeps building on that promise. He forms them into a people. That's Exodus 19 to 20. He gives them a way of life that reflects what He's like. And then He promises something more. A king will come from David's line who will bring everlasting peace. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 13. And as the story continues, the prophets keep pointing forward. Someone is coming. Someone is coming. And that leads us to redemption. After centuries of waiting, Jesus arrives. And from the very beginning, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, we're told something important. He is connected to Abraham and to David. He is the one the story was pointing to, Jesus. He teaches, he heals, he forgives, he welcomes people who were often pushed aside. And then he goes to the cross. Not by accident, but willingly. And we see that in Mark 10:45 and John 10:17 through 18. On the cross, Jesus steps into our place. He carries what we could not carry, the weight of our sin. 1 Peter 2:24. The distance between us and God, so that forgiveness is not just possible, it's real. And the relationship that was broken can be restored. And 3 days later, he rises. Death is not the end anymore. This is redemption, God doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. And all those promises throughout the story, they come together here. They find their fulfillment in him. 2 Corinthians 1:20 and Luke 24:44. Everything before was leading here. Everything after flows from here. But the story doesn't end there. It moves forward toward restoration. The Bible ends with a picture of everything made new. God with his people again. See Revelation 21:3-5. No more death. No more suffering. No more separation. The story that began in a garden ends in a restored world. The Bible is one story. A story of God restoring what was broken. Creation, fall, promise, redemption, restoration. And when you begin to see that pattern, the rest starts to make sense. The laws, the prophets, the letters, they all fit into this bigger story. So if the Bible has ever felt overwhelming or confusing, this is the thread that holds it all together. And now you know how to see it. Next time, we'll look at the people who wrote these words and how God worked through real lives to tell this story across time. Until then, keep reading, keep seeking, and keep growing in your faith.